The rain had been falling since before midnight, turning the narrow dirt road into something that swallowed headlights whole. A rusted Ford pickup sat half buried in the mud at the edge of a Montana lake, its engine ticking quiet as the storm rolled through. Inside, a man sat with both hands on the wheel and nowhere left to go. His name was Marcus Cole. He was 38 years old, though most mornings he felt closer to 60. His hands were large and scarred across the knuckles, the kind of hands that had done difficult things in difficult places and never quite forgotten them. His face carried the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistook for calm, but was really something else entirely, the stillness of a man who had learned to hold very still so the thing inside him would not wake up. In the passenger seat, pressed against his right shoulder, sat Scout. Scout was a German shepherd, 7 years old, with a broad chest and ears that never fully relaxed. He had been trained by the United States military to detect explosive devices and track missing personnel through conditions that would have broken most animals. He had done those things faithfully and without complaint for 4 years. Then the program ended and Marcus adopted him, and the two of them had been together every day since, through the good years and through the years that were not good at all. The lake outside was called Clearwater. The name felt like a joke tonight. The water was black and restless, hammered flat by rain, and the mountains beyond it had disappeared entirely into clouds. Somewhere on the other side of the lake, barely visible through the weather, was a dark shape that might have been a cabin. Marcus looked at it for a long time. Then he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was soft along the creases from being opened and closed too many times. He unfolded it in the dark and read it by the dim green light of the dashboard, though by now he had memorized every word. Cave property, Clearwater Lake Road, $20, as is, no questions. Earl Dunning. He folded it back up, tucked it into his shirt pocket against his chest. Scout made a low sound in his throat, not quite a whine, not quite a growl. Something in between. His ears were forward and his eyes were fixed on the dark shape across the water. "I know," Marcus said. He opened the truck door and stepped out into the rain. To understand how a man like Marcus Cole ended up at the edge of a Montana lake with $20 and a German shepherd and nothing else worth mentioning, you have to go back. Not all the way back, not to the beginning, because the beginning was ordinary enough. A boy from Colorado, a decent student, a young man who enlisted at 19 because he wanted to be part of something larger than himself, and because there was a particular kind of man he had decided to become. He became that man. He served 2 tours overseas in places that never made the front page of any newspaper, doing work that the government preferred not to describe in detail. He was good at it not because he enjoyed it, but because he was careful and he was steady, and he understood in a way that some men never do, that fear is not the enemy. Fear is information. What you do with it is the choice. He came home with a chest full of medals and a mind full of things he could not explain to anyone who had not been there. He married a woman named Claire who was a school teacher and who laughed easily and who had a particular gift for sitting beside him in silence without making the silence feel heavy. She understood that some rooms in him were closed, and she never tried to force them open. She just kept the light on in the hallway. For a while it was enough. He worked private security in Denver, got promoted, built something that looked like a normal life from the outside. Scout joined them during those years, a retired military working dog who needed a home, and Marcus needed something that required care. They were a good match from the first day. Then Claire got sick. It happened the way those things happen, quietly at first, then all at once. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Marcus took leave from work to be with her, and when she was gone, he went back to the job and found that he could not do it. Not because of incompetence, because something had come loose inside him, some load-bearing wall that Claire had quietly been holding up without either of them knowing it. The nightmares came back, the hypervigilance, the way a car backfiring 2 blocks away could send him to the floor of a grocery store with his heart running at combat speed. He had one bad episode at work and they let him go with a handshake and a thin envelope and a phone number for a counseling service he never called. One missed payment led to another. The apartment went. The savings went faster than he expected. He spent 3 weeks in a shelter in Denver before he realized that shelters were harder for him than the truck was, all those bodies and sounds and unpredictable movements in the dark. He packed what he could fit in the Ford and he left. That was 6 months ago. He and Scout drifted through Wyoming in the fall working day labor when they could find it fencing, hauling, clearing land. They slept in rest stops and on the edges of campgrounds where the fee collectors did not come after dark. Some nights they ate well. Other nights Marcus split whatever was in his pack with Scout and went to sleep still hungry, which he found easier to manage than he expected. Hunger was simple. He understood hunger. It was the dreams he could not manage. The dreams were not always of combat, which surprised people when he described them the few times he tried. Sometimes they were just of Claire, of her hands, of the particular way she used to stand at the kitchen window in the morning, with her coffee looking out at nothing, thinking thoughts she never shared. In the dreams, he would be standing right behind her, and he would reach out to touch her shoulder, and his hand would pass through her like smoke. And then the kitchen would be somewhere else, somewhere hot and loud. And there would be sweating where the linoleum had been. He would wake up with Scout pressed against him, heavy and warm, breathing slow. That was always how it ended. Scout pressing against him, breathing slow. He found the notice on a Tuesday in October, tacked to the corkboard outside a feed and supply store in a small town called Millbrook, in population just under 2,000 in the western foothills of the Bitterroot Range. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and the thumbtack holding it was brown with rust, but the handwriting was clear enough. Large, deliberate letters, the kind a man writes when he wants to make sure there is no misunderstanding. Marcus stood in front of it for a long time. $20 was what he had, not $20 left over. $20 total, folded in his front pocket beside his pocket knife, and a photograph of Claire that he had been carrying so long, the edges had gone soft as fabric. He pulled out the paper and read it again. Then he found a payphone outside the store and called the number. The voice on the other end was old and dry as paper, but direct. Earl Dunning said he would meet Marcus in the parking lot of the Millbrook Diner at 3 o'clock. He said to bring cash. He said there was nothing else to discuss on the phone. Marcus was there at 2:45. Scout sat beside him on the bench outside and watched the road. Earl Dunning arrived in a truck even older than Marcus's, a faded green Chevy from the early 80s with a cracked windshield and a bumper held on by wire. He was a thin man, maybe 72, with a face like weathered saddle leather and eyes that were sharp in the way that some old people's eyes get sharper than they were young, as if age had burned away everything non-essential and left only the part that sees. He walked slowly. He carried a small device clipped to his belt that Marcus recognized after a moment as a portable oxygen concentrator, the kind used by people with serious heart conditions who needed supplemental oxygen but were not yet confined to a hospital. They shook hands without names. Earl looked at Scout for a moment with something in his expression that Marcus could not read. Then he handed over a single key on a plain ring and accepted the $20 without counting it. "The road ends at the lake," Earl said. "The cabin's on the north shore. Can't miss it. Cave's built right into the hill behind." Marcus nodded. "How long has it been empty?" "Long time." "Why are you selling all?" Earl looked at him steadily. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he said, "Because I can't do what needs doing anymore. And because you've got the right dog." Marcus waited for more. There was no more. Earl turned to go, then stopped. Without turning back around, he said, "Don't ignore the dig. Whatever he finds, he's earned the right to show you." Then he got in the green Chevy and drove away. Scout watched the truck until it disappeared around the bend. He did not growl. He did not bark. His tail was still, and his body was relaxed, the particular body language of a trained detection dog that has assessed something and found it safe. Marcus looked down at him. All right, he said. The road to Clearwater Lake was unpaved and steep in places, dropping through pine forests so dense the headlights barely reached the trees on either side. The truck rattled and slid on the wet gravel. Once the rear wheels broke loose on a switchback and Marcus steered into the slide without thinking the way driving in bad conditions gets built into muscle memory after enough years. Scout rode with his nose at the gap in the window, reading the air, until Marcus rolled the window up against the cold. The cabin appeared in the headlights like something dredged up from another era. Small and low-built of rough timber that had grayed over decades of weather, it sat on the north shore of the lake with its back pressed into a hillside of dark rock. The cave opening was visible behind it, a wide, irregular mouth of shadow where the hill receded with the cabin built right up against it like a front room built onto something older and stranger. The porch step was missing. 3 window panes were cracked. The door hung at a slight angle that suggested the frame had shifted over years of frost and thaw. A rusted hand pump stood beside the south wall, and a wood pile under a metal lean-to had mostly collapsed into rot. Marcus sat in the truck with the engine off for a moment looking at it. It was the ugliest thing he had ever considered calling home. He got out. Scout leaped down beside him and immediately began moving in careful, deliberate circles, the inspection pattern nose, low moving outward from the cabin door in expanding rings. Marcus let him work. Inside the cabin smelled of cold ash and damp wood and something mineral underneath a clean stone smell that rose from the cave beyond the back wall. A single main room with a wood stove, a small table, 2 chairs with cracked seats, a shelf that had partially separated from the wall. Beyond a low doorway, the cave itself wide and surprisingly deep, the ceiling rising to about 8 feet at the entrance and disappearing into darkness further back. The stone floor was cold under his boots, but the air held a faint warmth, the natural insulation of rock that had been absorbing heat from the earth for longer than the cabin had existed. He lit the wood stove with kindling from the only dry section of the pile and got a small fire going. He found a functional kerosene lantern on the shelf with maybe an inch of fuel left and lit that too. The cabin filled with the kind of thin golden light that makes broken things look almost bearable. Scout moved through every room. He checked the cabin methodically, then went through the low doorway into the cave and disappeared into the dark. Marcus could hear him, the soft pad of paws on stone, the occasional sound of him sniffing hard, the scratch of his nails changing direction. Then the sound stopped. Marcus lifted the lantern and went through the doorway. Scout was in the back left corner of the cave in the deepest shadow, sitting perfectly still. Not alert still, not tense still. Something else, the stillness of a day that has located what it was looking for and is now waiting for the human to catch up. His eyes, when the lantern light reached them, were fixed on the ground directly in front of him. Marcus crouched and held the lantern lower. The floor of the cave was solid stone throughout except for that one corner. In that single patch, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, the surface was different. Darker, slightly lower than the surrounding rock. Packed earth and small stones pressed down smooth but visibly unmistakably different from the natural cave floor. Someone had filled that spot in. Deliberately, a long time ago. Scout looked up at Marcus, then back down at the ground. "Not tonight," Marcus said quietly. He straightened up. He was tired in a way that had no bottom to it. He needed sleep more than he needed answers. He put his hand on Scout's neck and felt the dog lean slightly into the touch. They went back to the main room. Marcus unrolled his sleeping bag on the floor in front of the wood stove and laid down with his boots still on. Scout curled beside him close enough that Marcus could feel the heat of him through the sleeping bag. The fire crackled. Rain moved across the roof in waves. Marcus stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing for a long time. This was a skill he had developed, not peace exactly, but the ability to hold the mind empty for a few minutes at a time to let the machinery idle. He was almost asleep when the first crack of thunder rolled across the lake. It happened fast, the way it always happened fast. The sound split something open in his chest, and he was no longer in Montana. He was somewhere else entirely, a place without color except the particular shade of orange that heat makes in certain kinds of light. There was weight on him, equipment, the smell of hot metal and dust, and something underneath that he had never been able to name. Voices shouting in a language he had learned to understand and would spend the rest of his life wishing he had not learned. A door, metal, being pulled open too fast. He was on his feet before he was awake. His back was against the cabin wall, and his hands were up, and there was nothing in front of him but firelight and shadows in the small ordinary room. Then Scout hit him. Not hard. Scout never hit him hard, but with full weight, all 68 pounds of him pressing his entire body against Marcus's legs and lower chest, warm and solid and absolutely present. The dog's breath was on his hands. Marcus could feel Scout's ribs expanding and contracting, slow, steady, deliberate breathing. He grabbed the fur at Scout's neck with both hands. The room stayed a room. He breathed. In for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, the technique a counselor had tried to teach him once, back when he still went to counseling. It had seemed useless at the time. It was not useless. Scout breathed. Marcus breathed. The fire crackled. After a while, maybe 2 minutes, maybe Marcus slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. Scout climbed partly into his lap, which he was technically too large to do, and Marcus let him. "Scout," he said. His voice came out rough. "I hear you." The dog pressed his nose against Marcus's jaw and held it there. Outside, the thunder had moved east. The rain was lighter now. Through the single south-facing window, Marcus could see the lake, black and restless, still but quieter. He sat there for a long time, one hand buried in Scout's fur, until the shaking in his arms stopped and his heart rate came down and the other place receded back to where it lived, which was somewhere behind his eyes in the dark. He did not sleep again that night, but he stayed on the floor with the pew and the firelight, and that was enough. In the gray morning, when the rain had stopped and the lake was the color of pewter and the pines dripped steadily in the silence, Marcus walked the perimeter of the property. He was not a man who walked anywhere without purpose, and his purpose here was to understand what he had bought: the cabin, the hillside, the narrow strip of shoreline, the tree line to the north and east where the forest came close. He walked it all with Scout ranging ahead of him, nose working, reading the ground the way he had been trained to read it. It was Scout who stopped first. He stopped at the northeast corner of the cabin near the base of the porch foundation and went still in the way. He went still when he found something. Nose down, one paw slightly raised. Marcus came up beside him and looked at what Scout had found. Footprints, boot prints pressed deep into the soft earth that the rain had left behind, 2 sets different sizes overlapping in places, leading from the tree line to the cabin wall and back again. The tread pattern was industrial, deep-lugged, the kind of boot worn by men who worked outdoors in rough conditions or who wanted to be prepared for rough conditions. They were fresh. The edges were still sharp. The rain had stopped before midnight, which meant these prints had been made after midnight. Marcus crouched and studied them without touching them. He followed the trail with his eyes from the trees along the cabin wall around the north side toward the cave entrance and back into the forest. Whoever had made them had walked the full perimeter of the cabin, come close to the cave mouth, and then left. Not kids, not curious neighbors. The pattern was deliberate, the walk of someone doing reconnaissance. Scout looked up at him. His ears were flat back and his tail was low. "I know," Marcus said again. He put his hand briefly on the dog's head. "I see it." He stood up. He looked at the tree line for a long time. Nothing moved in it, but that meant nothing. Someone had known about this property, had been watching it, had come in the night after Marcus arrived to have a closer look. He went inside and made coffee on the camp stove he kept in the truck. He drank it standing at the window, watching the tree line, and thought about Earl Dunning's voice on the phone, dry and careful, and choosing every word. Don't ignore the dog, not "you'll like the cabin," not "it's a bargain," but don't ignore the dog, as if Earl Dunning had known something would need ignoring. The truck came on the third day in the early afternoon when Marcus was replacing the missing porch step with a board he had found under the collapsed woodshed. It was a black Suburban late model with tinted windows and clean tires that had no business being clean on a road like this one. It parked at the far end of the access road where the trees opened up and sat there for a moment before the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was perhaps 57 years old, built solidly without being large with silver hair, cut short in a gray suit that fit precisely, in a posture that communicated without any particular effort that he was accustomed to being the most significant person in any room he entered. He walked toward Marcus without hurrying, as if the mud did not concern him, as if the remoteness of the location did not concern him, as if nothing in the world had ever concerned him very much. Scout came around the corner of the cabin and stopped. His body dropped into a low, wide stance, weight forward, ears forward, the controlled stillness of a military dog that has assessed a threat and is waiting for instruction. A sound built in his chest, not loud, deep. The man stopped about 15 feet away and smiled. It was a good smile practiced, and even the kind deployed by men who had learned that smiling early established a useful dynamic. "Marcus Cole," he said, not a question. "You know my name," Marcus said. "Small county, word gets around." He put his hands in his jacket pockets casually, but Marcus noted it. "My name is Harlan Voss. I run a company called Voss Mineral Group. We have operations throughout western Montana." A brief pause. "We have an interest in this property." "It's not for sale." Harlan Voss nodded slowly as if this was a reasonable position he had considered in advance. "I understand, but I'd like you to hear a number before you decide that firmly." He mentioned a figure. $30,000. Cash, no delays, no paperwork complications, no need to involve anyone else. Marcus set down his hammer. "Who said there were complications?" Something moved behind Harlan Voss's eyes, quick as a fish in deep water, and then it was gone. Properties in this area often have title complexities. History, it can get burdensome. I'm offering you a way past all of that. Scout's growl deepened. He had not moved. He was still in that low forward stance, and his eyes had not left Harlan Voss's face. Marcus looked at his dog. Then he looked at Harlan Voss. "The answer is no," Marcus said. A long beat. Harlan Voss held his smile. He looked slowly and deliberately at the cave mouth behind the cabin. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he knows the value of, not curious, but calculating. "Interesting piece of geology," he said almost to himself. Then he looked back at Marcus. "Some land carries more weight than it appears to, more history than people realize when they buy it." Another pause shorter. "I hope you find it worth the difficulty." He turned and walked back to the Suburban. He did not look back. The truck reversed smoothly onto the access road and disappeared into the trees. Scout stayed in his low stance for a full 30 seconds after the engine sound had faded. Then he straightened, shook himself once, and looked at Marcus. Marcus stood very still. He had spent enough years reading threat assessments to know what one felt like. Harlan Voss had not made a threat, technically speaking. Every word he had said could have been innocent. But the combination, the knowledge of Marcus's name, the cash offers, the pointed look at the cave, the careful mention of complications was not innocent. It was a map drawn in polite language of something that had been here before Marcus arrived and intended to still be here after he left. He picked up his hammer. He finished the porch step. But he was thinking about Earl Dunning's thin voice on the phone. "Don't ignore the dog." And he was thinking about the footprints in the mud at the base of the porch. And he was thinking about the patch of filled-in earth at the back of the cave the one Scout had found on the first night and had not stopped returning to in the 3 days since, sitting beside it in the mornings, lying near it, in the afternoons, watching it the way a trained dog watches a location that contains something it has been trained to find. The fourth night came in cold and clear, the storm having finally moved east and left the sky above the Bitterroots blazing with stars. Marcus sat outside on the new porch step with a cup of coffee and looked at the lake. The water was still now reflecting the stars in long broken ribbons. An owl somewhere in the pines asked its question and received no answer. He thought about Claire. He thought about the way she used to say that the thing about veterans was not that they could not feel things, but that they felt everything too much and had been trained to show nothing, and that the two forces together were like a river dammed up in a very small space. She had not said this as criticism. She had said it the way she said most things, carefully and with the specific intention of being understood rather than being right. He missed her the way you miss a limb, not constantly but continuously in the background of everything, always there, sometimes sharp and sometimes just a dull awareness of absence. Scout came out and sat beside him. They stayed like that for a while in the cold and the silence. Then Scout stood up. His ears snapped forward. His nose lifted, working the air coming off the lake. He turned and walked to the cabin door, stopped, looked back at Marcus. Then he went inside. Marcus followed. Scout went straight through the main room and through the low doorway into the cave without hesitating. Marcus took the lantern from its hook and lit it and followed. The flame threw long shadows across the stone walls. The air was cool and clean and smelled of deep earth. Scout was in the back corner, the left corner, the same corner he had sat in every night since they arrived. But tonight was different. Tonight Scout barked, once sharp and short and loud enough that the sound bounced off every stone surface in the cave and came back from three directions at once. Then he dropped his nose to the filled-in earth and began to dig. Not the tentative pawing of an uncertain dog, the serious, committed digging of a trained detection animal that has decided the time for patience is over. Marcus crouched down beside him. He held the lantern close and looked at the earth the Scout was disturbing. In the lantern light, he could see it clearly now. The way the soil was a different color. Darker brown, looser in structure, clearly placed there by human hands. The surrounding cave floor was pale gray stone, solid as the mountain it was part of. This patch was an anomaly, an intrusion. Someone had dug this hole once a long time ago, and then filled it back in. Marcus reached out and pressed his palm flat against the earth. It was cold, dense, but not stone. He stood up slowly. He looked down at Scout, still digging steadily, his big paws turning up dark soil in rhythmic strokes. He thought about $30,000 offered in cash by a man who knew his name. He thought about footprints in the mud that had not been there at sunset. He thought about an old man with a failing heart who had driven 2 hours to hand over a key for $20 and had not once asked what Marcus planned to do with the place. Don't ignore the dog. Whatever he finds, he's earned the right to show you. Marcus went to the truck. He came back with the short-handled camp shovel from the kit behind the seat. He crouched down beside Scout. He set the lantern on a nearby outcrop of rock where it would throw light on the corner. He put the blade of the shovel against the earth. "All right," he said quietly. "Show me." And he began to dig. The shovel struck metal at 23 minutes past midnight. Marcus felt it before he heard it, a hard resistance traveling up through the handle into his palms, different from the resistance of packed earth or stone. He stopped. He set the shovel aside and went down to his knees and used his hands the way archaeologists do, the way soldiers do, when they are not sure what they are about to uncover and want to feel it before they see it. The dirt came away in clumps, cold, dense, smelling of iron and deep time. What emerged from the earth was a box. Steel construction, roughly 18 inches long and 12 wide, with reinforced corners and a latch mechanism that Marcus recognized from military service, the kind of hardware used on waterproof field containers, built to survive conditions that would destroy ordinary storage. The exterior was heavily rusted brown-orange along the seams, but the construction underneath was solid. Whoever had built this box had built it to last. He lifted it free of the hole and set it on the cave floor. Scout sat back on his haunches and watched. His work was done. He had found the thing. The rest was Marcus's problem. Marcus sat cross-legged in front of the boss with the lantern between them and looked at it for a long moment without touching it. There was a weight to the moment that he could not entirely explain, not superstition. He was not a superstitious man, but something close to respect. Whatever was in this box had been here longer than he had been alive. Someone had put it in the ground deliberately in a place they believed was hidden and sealed it and walked away. That act carried gravity. He worked the latch. It resisted the rust in the mechanism, making the metal stiff and reluctant, but it gave after a moment with a sound like a small bone breaking. He lifted the lid. Inside, nested in what had once been burlap but had degraded over decades into something closer to brown dust, were 3 velvet bags drawn closed with leather cords. Beside them, wrapped in oilskin that had kept better than the burlap, was a bundle of documents. Marcus opened the first bag. Gold coins tumbled into his palm, heavy, warm-colored, even in lantern light, stamped with dates from the 1920s and 1930s. American Eagles, St. Gaudens, Double Eagles coins that a collector would have recognized immediately as significant. He counted 12 in the first bag. The second bag held silver Morgan dollars and peace dollars, heavier than the gold, the faces worn smooth with handling. The third bag held jewelry, a woman's brooch set with small garnets, a man's pocket watch with a cracked crystal, 2 plain gold rings, a locket on a chain that Marcus did not open. He set the bags aside and turned to the documents. The oilskin had done its work. The papers inside were yellowed and brittle at the edges, but legible. The ink faded to brown in places, but consistent, the handwriting of a man who had written with care and intention. The top document was a property survey dated March 1941, stamped with the seal of Ravalli County, Montana. It described in legal language a parcel of land totaling 412 acres in the Clearwater Lake drainage, including mineral rights to a silver deposit, surveyed and confirmed in the spring of that year. At the bottom, the owner of record, Thomas Aldrich. The second document was a deed, same land, same owner, recorded June 1941 with the county clerk. The third was a surveyor's assessment, more technical, describing the silver deposit in geological terms. Marcus did not fully understand, but at the bottom was a line he understood completely. Estimated recoverable value at current market, $1.8 to $2.4 million, 1941 dollars. Marcus sat back on his heels and did the math in his head, adjusted for inflation, adjusted for current silver prices. He arrived at a number that did not seem real, sitting in a cave in a cabin he had bought for $20. He set the assessment aside and found the last document in the bundle. It was not official. No stamps, no notary seal. Just a single sheet of paper folded twice, written in the same deliberate hand as the survey notes, but faster. The pen had pressed harder in places, as if the writer's hand had been unsteady. To whoever finds this, my name is Thomas Aldrich. I am writing this on the 14th of November, 1941. I am hiding this box because I no longer trust that what I own will remain mine. A man named Harold Voss has made clear that he intends to acquire the mineral rights to this land regardless of my wishes. He has lawyers. He has connections to the county government that I do not have. I am not naive enough to think that the law will protect me simply because the law is on my side. If you are reading this, something has gone wrong. The land is yours now. Find Thomas Aldrich, or find what became of him, and you will understand why this box was buried. The dog knows. Dogs always know. Marcus read that last line twice. He looked up at Scout. Scout was watching him with the particular attention he reserved for moments when something important was happening that he could not fully parse but knew mattered. Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the oilskin. He looked around the cave, at the stone walls, at the dark ceiling, at the mouth of the cave where the Montana night showed through the cabin's rear doorway as a rectangle of cold starlight. Thomas Aldrich had buried this box in 1941, And then, according to his own letter, something had gone wrong. Marcus pulled out his phone and searched the name. The results were sparse but clear enough. A brief entry in a regional history database. The Aldrich family, Thomas, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children had vanished from their property near Clearwater Lake in the autumn of 1943. No bodies were ever found. The case had been investigated briefly by county authorities and then closed as inconclusive. The property had passed through unclear legal channels over the following decade and eventually been acquired by a company called Voss Mineral Holdings in 1952. Voss. Marcus set the phone down on the cave floor. He looked at it. He looked at the box. He looked at Scout. Harlan Voss, he said aloud in the quiet of the cave. The name sat in the air and did not improve. He almost missed it. He was replacing the documents in the oilskin when his fingers found something at the very bottom of the box beneath the burlap dust, pressed flat against the steel floor. A small envelope, much newer than everything else, the paper still white, not yellowed, the edges still sharp. His name was not on it. Just 2 words in blue ink and handwriting that was not Thomas Aldrich's, opened carefully. Inside was a single folded note. There is more. Northwest corner, outside under the iron pipe. Don't open that one here. You'll know when. E.D. Marcus stared at it for a long time. Earl Dunning had been here before him, had found this box or had known about it, or both, had left this note, had sold the land for $20 to a stranger with a military working dog because he could no longer do whatever needed doing himself. The oxygen concentrator on his belt, the careful eyes, the way he had looked at Scout. Don't ignore the dog. Whatever he finds, he's earned the right to show you. Earl Dunning had not been selling a piece of property. He had been passing a responsibility. Marcus sat in the cave until the lantern fuel began to gutter. Scout pressed warm against his side and thought about what it meant to be handed something by a dying man who had run out of time. He found a lawyer in Millbrook the next morning. He had to ask at the gas station because there was no sign he could find, and the attendant, a teenager who looked at Scout with open admiration, said there was one attorney in town who handled land disputes, a woman named Diane Mercer, whose office was above the hardware store on Main Street. The office was small and organized with the particular precision of someone who worked alone and could not afford disorder. Bookshelves, floor to ceiling. A desk that was completely clear except for a yellow legal pad and 2 pens arranged parallel to each other. Behind the desk, a woman in her mid-40s with dark hair going gray at the temples, in the kind of composed, watchful face that made Marcus think she had learned at some point not to show her reactions until she had decided what they were. She looked at Scout when they came in. She looked at Marcus. She said, "Sit down," without asking who he was or why he was there, which he appreciated. He told her the outline, the cabin, the box, the documents. Thomas Aldrich. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the yellow legal pad, and then she said, "Harlan Voss came to see you. 3rd day, $30,000. Cash." She wrote something on the pen. Then she said, "He offered me money once too, to not take certain cases." A pause. "I didn't take it." Marcus waited. She put the pen down and looked at him directly. "My father worked as an engineer at a Voss mineral operation south of here in 1987. There was an accident, a tunnel collapse. 3 men died, my father among them. The investigation was handled by a county safety board that Harlan Voss, who was 29 years old at the time, had significant influence over." She said this without heat, which Marcus understood was harder than saying it with heat. The findings were sealed by court order. The families received settlements with non-disclosure agreements. I have spent 18 years trying to find a way around that seal. She picked up the pen again. What you have in that box may be the first piece of evidence I've encountered that predates Harlan Voss's ability to manage outcomes. If Thomas Aldrich documented what Harold Voss did to his family in 1943, and if that documentation connects to how Voss Mineral Holdings acquired the land in 1952, Then what you have is not just a property dispute. She looked at him. It's a pattern. Scout had settled on the floor beside Marcus's chair. His head was up, ears forward, watching Diane Mercer with attention. She looked at the man and something in her expression shifted slightly, not softened exactly, but something. He's not growling, she said. He doesn't growl at people he's decided are trustworthy, Marcus said. She considered this seriously. All right, she said. Show me what's in the box. The papers from the box were spread across her desk when her phone rang. She looked at the screen, set it face down without answering, and looked back at the survey documents. The 1952 acquisition, she said, tapping the deed with one finger. Voss Mineral Holdings filed that with the county clerk using a contract that claimed Thomas Aldrich had signed over mineral rights in a private transaction. She pulled a folder from the shelf behind her desk and opened it. I have a copy of that contract. Got it through a public records request 3 years ago. She laid it beside the survey. Thomas Aldrich's signature appears on a document dated April 1952. Thomas Aldrich disappeared in autumn 1943. He could not have signed anything in 1952. The room was quiet. That's fraud, Marcus said. It's worse than fraud, Diane said. If Thomas Aldrich was dead and Harold Voss knew he was dead, and Harold Voss signed his name on a legal document in 1952, anyway, that's evidence of consciousness of guilt. It means Harold Voss knew what had happened to the Aldrich family because a man cannot forge the signature of someone he believes might eventually appear and contest it. She closed the folder. Harold Voss didn't forge Thomas Aldrich's name because he was careless. He forged it because he was certain the Aldriches would never come back. Marcus sat with that for a moment. What do I do next? He said. Tonight, nothing. Tomorrow. She paused. Earl Dunning's note mentioned a second location. Northwest corner, iron pipe. Don't touch it yet. Not until I've filed a protective order on the property. If Harlan Voss has any indication that you found the first box, he may try to access the property before we can establish legal standing. She began writing on the legal pad. Go back to the cabin. Lock what you have. Don't discuss this with anyone in town. She looked up. And keep the dog close. He drove back to Clearwater through the afternoon. The sky over the mountains was a hard, clear blue, and the road through the pines threw long shadow bars across the truck hood. Scout rode with his head up, watching the forest. Marcus was 2 miles from the cabin when he saw the Suburban. Black, late model, clean tires, parked in a logging turnout just off the main road, engine off, no visible occupant. The same vehicle or one identical to it, positioned at an angle that gave the driver a clear view of the road toward Clearwater Lake. Marcus drove past without slowing. He watched the Suburban in his rearview mirror. It did not move. Scout had seen it too. He was facing backward through the rear window, stiff and focused. I know, Marcus said. At the cabin, he walked the perimeter before going inside. The footprints were back, new ones overlapping the old maid since he had left that morning. 2 sets again, same industrial tread, but this time they had come closer to the cave mouth. One set showed clear impressions of someone crouching, deep toe marks, flattened heel, as if they had knelt at the cave entrance and looked in. Marcus went inside and checked the box. It was where he had left it, pushed beneath the wood stove, undisturbed. He made coffee and sat at the table and thought. 3 nights later, the power went out. There was no storm to explain it. The sky was clear and the temperature had dropped to the low 20s, but there was no wind to speak of. Marcus woke to complete darkness at 2 in the morning, Scout already on his feet, moving to the door. He pulled on boots and jacket and went outside with the flashlight. The power line that ran to the cabin from a junction box at the road had been cut. Cleanly at a point about 40 yards into the trees, not snapped by weather or wildlife, but severed with a tool. The cut ends of the wire were bright copper in the flashlight beam, exposed metal still almost shiny. Marcus stood in the cold and looked at the cut wire and then looked at the trees around him. Scout was working in slow circles, nose down, reading the ground. He stopped twice, both times at boot prints, the same industrial tread pressed firm and deep into the frozen ground. Two sets, coming from the road, going back to the road. He went back inside and sat with the flashlight and the camp lantern and did not sleep for the rest of the night. At 7 in the morning, he drove to town and found Sheriff Colt Deering at the diner on Main Street. Colt Deering was 52 and built like a man who had once been athletic and had let it settle into something denser and more permanent with age. He had a face that was not unkind but was professionally skeptical, the expression of a man who had spent enough years hearing one-sided stories that he no longer accepted any story at face value. He listened to Marcus's account of the cut wire and the footprints without comment, drinking his coffee. When Marcus finished, Deering set the mug down and said, "You file a report yet?" "No, came here first." Deering nodded slowly. "The Voss family has been doing business in this county since before I was born. That's not a threat, and it's not a recommendation. It's context." He looked at Marcus steadily. "I don't work for Harlan Voss, but I work in a county where Harlan Voss employs a significant number of people and where his family's name is on 3 buildings, including the library." Another pause. "You need to understand what you're dealing with before you understand what I can and can't do. Can you take a report about a cut power line?" "I can and will." He pulled a notebook from his jacket. "But I want you to understand that a cut power line in a remote property is difficult to attribute. Defense will argue weather, animals, equipment failure." He looked up from the notebook. "What I can tell you is that the men who cut that line were not kids and they were not local. I've seen that boot pattern before on a trespassing call at another property Voss had an interest in 2 years ago." He wrote something in the notebook. "That doesn't leave this conversation until I decide what to do with it." Marcus nodded. "Get a lawyer," Deering said. "Already have one." Something shifted in the sheriff's expression, almost approval. "Mercer." "Yes." Deering capped his pen. "Then you might be all right." He stood, dropping money on the table for his coffee. "Keep the dog close, Cole. I mean that." It was Scout who led him to the second location. Marcus had known where Earl's note pointed, the northwest corner, the iron pipe, but he had waited for Diane's protective order to be filed. 3 days of patience that had cost him sleep. The morning the order came through, he went outside in the thin early light with the camp shovel and found Scout already there, standing at the northwest corner of the cabin's exterior, nose pointed at the ground near a length of iron pipe that emerged from the earth at an angle, an old water line from a hand-dug well that had long since gone dry. The dog looked at him over his shoulder. "All right," Marcus said. "Together." He dug carefully, following the pipe down, scooping earth away from both sides until the shovel found resistance at about 18 inches. A tin container, smaller than the first box, the size of a large shoebox, soldered shut along the seam. He carried it inside. Opening the soldered seam took a screwdriver and 15 minutes of careful work. Inside, wrapped in wax cloth that had kept better than anything in the first box, were 2 items. The first was a photograph. Black and white, printed on heavy paper stock, dated on the back in pencil, August 1943. Thomas Aldrich stood in front of the cave mouth, younger than Marcus had imagined him, perhaps 40, with a broad open face and a posture of contained confidence. Beside him, close enough to suggest familiarity, stood a younger man in a well-cut suit. The younger man was smiling. On the back, in Thomas Aldrich's handwriting, HV, last meeting. "He still thinks I will sign. He will be back. Harold Voss," Harlan's grandfather, standing beside Thomas Aldrich 2 months before the family vanished. The second item made Marcus go completely still. It was a recording device, a wire recorder, the kind used in the late 1930s and 1940s, small enough to fit in a large coat pocket, with a spool of thin steel wire wound around a take-up reel. The machine was tarnished but intact. A handwritten label on the side in Thomas Aldrich's hand, November 12th, 1943. 2 days before he had written the letter in the first box. Marcus sat back and looked at the machine in the lantern light. His hands were perfectly steady, which surprised him. There was something almost sacred about holding an object that a man had trusted with a truth he was afraid would die with him. He called Diane. She arrived within the hour, and when she saw the wire recorder on the table, she sat down in the chair across from Marcus and was quiet for a long moment. "If there's a recording on that wire," she said, "and if it's recoverable, can it be recovered? There's a professor at the University of Montana in Missoula. He specializes in early audio restoration. I've spoken to him before for another case that didn't go anywhere." She reached out and touched the side of the machine without lifting it. "He restored a wire recording from 1938, 2 years ago. The wire on this one looks intact." She pulled her hand back. "Marcus, if Thomas Aldrich's voice is on this wire, and if he documented what Harold Voss did..." She stopped. "Say it," Marcus said. She looked at him. "Harlan Voss has spent 30 years building a version of history in which his family's wealth was legitimately acquired. If this recording contradicts that, not just the land deal but the disappearance, he doesn't just lose the mineral rights to your property. He loses everything. The company, the reputation, possibly his freedom." A pause. "And he will know that too." His scout had moved to the table. He put his chin on the edge and looked at the wire recorder with the same focused attention he had given the iron pipe and the filled-in earth. "How long to get the professor?" Marcus asked. "I'll call tonight. 3 days, maybe 4. She stood up. "Lock that machine somewhere. He can't reach it. Not in the cabin. Take it with you in the truck." She was already moving toward the door. Then she stopped. "There's something else," Marcus said. She turned. "The photograph. Look at the back." She picked it up and read the inscription. Something moved across her face, the expression of someone receiving information that confirms what they already knew, but had not wanted to be certain of. "He was there," she said. "Harold Voss was at that property 2 months before they disappeared." She set the photograph down carefully. "And Harlan has been telling anyone who will listen that his grandfather bought this land from the Aldrich family in a legitimate private sale." She picked up her bag. "A man cannot buy land from people he watched disappear." She left. Marcus heard her car on the gravel road fading into the pines. He sat alone in the cabin with the lantern and the wire recorder and Scout breathing slow beside him. Outside, without warning, a sound metal on wood, sharp and close. Something against the side of the cabin. Marcus was on his feet before the echo died, his body moving through the dark room, without thought operating on the training that lived below thought. He came around the north corner of the cabin in time to see 2 shapes moving fast from the cabin wall toward the tree line. Big men moving with purpose, dark clothing, faces covered. Scout blew past him. He had never heard Scout make the sound he made then. Not the controlled warning growl of surveillance, not the sharp alarm bark of alerting, but something older and rawer. A sound that belonged to what the dog had been before training, before the military, before any of it. He hit the nearest man at full speed, 68 pounds of German Shepherd, at a dead run, and took him to the ground. Marcus was 3 steps behind. What followed was brief and not complicated. 2 men against a former Navy SEAL who had not forgotten anything. The second man ran when he saw what was happening to the first. The one Scout had taken down was on the ground. Scout's jaws closed on his forearm, not biting through, holding the trained restraint of a bull that knows the difference between stopping and destroying. The man was large, and he was frightened, and he was making sounds that had no words in them. Marcus looked down at him. "Who sent you?" he said. The man did not answer. Marcus took out his phone and called Deering. Then he looked at Scout. The dog was breathing hard, sides heaving, but his grip was absolutely steady. "Good," Marcus said. "Hold." And then he saw it, Scout's left side under the rib cage, dark wet against the dark fur. In the struggle, the man had managed one blow with something heavy. A flashlight, it turned out later. The gash was deep enough to need stitching. Something tightened in Marcus's chest that was not combat calm and not fear. It was something more personal than either. He knelt down and put his hand gently on Scout's flank. The dog did not release his grip, did not look away from the man on the ground, but his tail moved once briefly, acknowledging the touch. "Hold," Marcus said again, his voice lower now. "I've got you." Deering arrived in 14 minutes. He looked at the scene, the man on the ground, Scout holding him, Marcus standing over both of them, and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "This time I'm writing all of it down." That night, after the man had been taken to county holding and Deering had photographed the boot prints and the tool marks on the cabin siding, after the vet in Millbrook had stitched Scout's flank with 6 sutures and given Marcus a kit for wound care, Marcus sat on the floor of the cabin with Scout's head in his lap. The dog's breathing was slow and even. The local anesthetic had worn off, and Marcus could tell from the slight stiffness when Scout shifted that it hurt, but the dog made no sound about it. He lay with his head on Marcus's thigh and his eyes half closed, simply present in the way he was always present, unconditionally, without complaint, without any apparent concept of personal cost. Marcus ran his hand along the uninjured side. The fur was thick and coarse at the outer layer, dense and soft underneath. He thought about what it had taken for a man like Thomas Aldrich to write the dog nose on a piece of paper in 1941 and mean it, to trust that whoever found the box would have a dog worth trusting, to leave a wire recorder and a photograph in an iron pipe and believe across the gulf of whatever was coming for him that the truth he was preserving would eventually reach someone who could use it. He thought about Earl Dunning, thin as paper, driving his green Chevy to a parking lot in Millbrook to hand a key to a stranger for $20 because he was running out of time and he had recognized something in the classified ad Marcus had placed. Looking for work, mechanical experience, military background, will travel, that told him this was the man. Or maybe it was the dog. Maybe it had always been the dog. Marcus looked down at Scout's face. The dark eyes were fully closed now, the ears relaxed in sleep, the big chest rising and falling. His phone lit up on the floor beside him. A text from Diane Professor confirmed, "Can see us in 3 days in Missoula. Bring the recorder. Don't tell anyone where you're going." And then 20 seconds later, a second text. "Also, I pulled the full county records on the Aldrich property transfer. Marcus. The 1952 contract, the one with Thomas Aldrich's forged signature. The notary who witnessed it worked exclusively for Harold Voss's company for 11 years. And the county clerk who recorded it retired 6 months later on a pension that was 3 times what his county salary should have allowed." A pause, and then, "This goes deeper than one family." Marcus set the phone face down on the floor. He put his hand on Scout's side, gently feeling the slow rhythm of the breathing, the warmth of the living animal under his palm. 3 days, he said quietly. Scout's ear twitched in sleep. Outside, the Montana night was clear and cold, and full of stars that had been burning long before Harold Voss was born and would still be burning long after whatever happened next. The lake was still. The pines were still. Inside the cabin, the wire recorder sat in its wax cloth wrapping in the locked metal case behind the truck seat, holding the voice of a man who had been afraid and had recorded his fear anyway because he believed it mattered. It had waited 80 years. It could wait 3 more days. The drive to Missoula took 2 hours through mountain passes that were beginning to show the first thin snow of the season along their upper ridges. Marcus drove with the wire recorder in its locked case on the back seat and Scout riding shotgun, and neither of them said anything for most of the journey, which was fine. They had never needed to fill silence with each other. Professor Elliot Graves worked out of a basement laboratory in the communications building at the University of Montana, a low-ceilinged room crowded with equipment that looked either very old or very new with nothing in between. He was a small man in his early 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the particular kind of focused energy that belongs to people who have spent decades caring deeply about something most other people have never considered. He shook Marcus's hand briefly and then looked at the wire recorder for a long time without touching it, the way a doctor looks at an X-ray before speaking. 1943, he said. Not a question. That's the date on the label. The wire itself is the variable. If it's corroded, if it's stretched or tangled, there may be nothing recoverable. He picked up the machine, finally turned it in his hands with great care. If it's intact and the wax cloth may have been sufficient, then yes, I've restored worse. He looked at Marcus over the reading glasses. Come back tomorrow morning. Marcus and Scout slept in the truck in a rest stop outside Missoula. He did not sleep well, but he slept. Scout curled against him in the cramped cab and breathed slow, and the night passed. The professor called at 7:43 in the morning. Marcus was already driving back toward the university when the phone rang. He put it on speaker. The wire is intact, Professor Graves said, corroded on the outer layers of the spool, but the inner recordings are of course recoverable. I've done a preliminary restoration. A pause, and in that pause, Marcus heard the professor choosing his words. Mr. Cole, what's on this wire? You need to hear it with your lawyer present. Diane was in Missoula by 10 o'clock. They sat in the professor's laboratory, Marcus, Diane, Scout lying on the floor between them, and listened to the voice of Thomas Aldrich speak across 80 years of silence. The recording quality was imperfect. There was a continuous background hiss, and certain words dropped out entirely where the wire had degraded. But Thomas Aldrich's voice was clear enough, and what he said was clear enough, and neither Marcus nor Diane spoke while it played. He identified himself, first name, date, location. November 12th, 1943. His voice was controlled, but not entirely steady. The voice of a man speaking for the record who knows the record may never be heard. He described Harold Voss. He described 3 meetings, the first 2 cordial, the third not. He described the offer Harold Voss had made for the mineral rights, generous at first, then less generous, then not an offer at all, but a statement. He described what Harold Voss had said at the 3rd meeting, which was that the Aldrich family's presence in Ravalli County had become an inconvenience that Harold Voss intended to resolve, and that the specific method of resolution would depend on whether Thomas Aldrich was willing to be reasonable. Then Thomas Aldrich's voice dropped lower, and he said, he told me the children would be the first to go, that no one looks for a family that doesn't have powerful friends, that Ravalli County has always taken care of its own, and we were not its own. The wire hissed. I have not signed. I will not sign. I am leaving this recording because I believe what he told me. I believe he will come back, and I believe he will do what he said. If my family disappears, if you are hearing this, and we are engaged, Harold Voss is the reason. I have no other enemies. I have done nothing to deserve this except own land that another man wants. A long pause on the recording. The sound of breathing. My wife's name is Margaret. My children are named James, Helen, and Clara. James is 12, Helen is 9, Clara is 6. I want someone to know their names. The wire hissed. The dog knows. Dogs always know. If you found this, you have a good day. Trust him. Then the sound of footsteps somewhere in the recording distant outside the room where Thomas Aldrich was speaking. The sound of something striking wood hard and deliberate. A door. Thomas Aldrich's voice suddenly lower and faster. They're at the door, and then nothing. The wire ran on in silence for another 40 seconds, and then the professor reached forward and stopped the playback. The laboratory was very quiet. Diane had her hands flat on her knees, and she was looking at the wall. Marcus was looking at the recorder. Scout had gotten up from the floor at some point during the playback and was sitting pressed against Marcus's leg, and Marcus had not noticed until now. He put his hand on the dog's head. James, Helen, and Clara, he said. Yes, Diane said. Her voice was completely even, which Marcus understood by now was the way she handled things that affected her deeply. She reached into her bag and took out a folder. She opened it on the workbench beside the recorder. Inside were documents she had gathered over the preceding days: the forged 1952 contract, the notary records, the county clerk's pension documentation, the surveyor's original 1941 assessment, the photograph of Harold Voss at the cave mouth in August 1943. She laid them in a row. 3 months after this recording, she said, the Aldrich family was gone. 9 years after that, Harold Voss filed a contract bearing Thomas Aldrich's forged signature to establish legal ownership of the land. She tapped the photograph. He was at that property in August 1943. Thomas Aldrich recorded this in November 1943. The family disappeared that autumn. She looked at Marcus. Harold Voss did not buy this land. He took it. And then he wrote a dead man's name on a piece of paper to make it look like a purchase. She began stacking the documents back into the folder. I'm filing for an emergency injunction this afternoon, she said. I'm also contacting the FBI field office in Helena. What Thomas Aldrich described constitutes evidence relevant to an 80-year-old disappearance, which is a federal matter. The forged contract is federal fraud. She closed the folder. Harlan Voss is going to find out about this before the week is over. There is no way to prevent that. Marcus nodded. When he finds out, she said, looking at him directly, the pressure will increase. Whatever he did before the cut wire the men at the cabin, that will look mild by comparison. He has a great deal more to lose now. I know. She held his gaze for a moment. Are you ready for that? Marcus thought about the men in the dark outside the cabin. He thought about Scout's ribs under his hands, the dark wet against dark fur. He thought about Thomas Aldrich, alone in a room with a wire recorder, speaking to no one, asking only that someone remember his children's names. Yes, he said. The hearing was set for the second week of November in the Ravalli County Courthouse in Hamilton, a small building of pale stone that had been administering local justice since 1909, and looked it. The gallery filled an hour before the scheduled start. Marcus had not expected that. He had not expected the pickup trucks in the parking lot, the men in work jackets, in worn boots, the older women with folded hands. Millbrook was a small town, and small towns run on story, and this story had been running for 3 weeks through every diner and gas station and hardware store in the county. Harlan Voss arrived with 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than most of the gallery's combined wardrobes. He did not look at Marcus when he entered. He sat with perfect posture at the respondents' table and spoke in low voices with his legal team and showed nothing on his face. He was, Marcus thought, very good at showing nothing on his face. He had probably been doing it his whole life. Marcus sat at the petitioner's table with Diane on his left and Scout on the floor to his right. Scout's stitches had come out 4 days earlier. The fur over the scar was growing back unevenly, the new growth shorter and slightly lighter than the surrounding coat. He sat with his left shoulder touching Marcus's right foot, light contact barely perceptible, but there. The judge was a woman named Hartwell, 60-something, with the compressed patience of someone who had sat through a great many cases in which people believed their version of events was definitively true. She reviewed the filings for several minutes without speaking in the courtroom, entirely silent. Then she said, Ms. Mercer, you may proceed. Diane presented the evidence in the order they had discussed, ascending order of impact, each piece laying the foundation for the next. The property survey of 1941. Thomas Aldrich's name on a deed recorded with Ravalli County. The land was his. That was the foundation. The photograph from August 1943. Harold Voss at the Clearwater Lake property, standing beside Thomas Aldrich. Taken 3 months before the family disappeared. That established presence and relationship. The forensic document analysis performed by an examiner Diane had retained in Billings. The 1952 contract the One Voss Mineral Holdings had used to establish ownership bore a signature that did not match any verified sample of Thomas Aldrich's handwriting and showed characteristics consistent with a signature produced by a different individual attempting to replicate handwriting from a secondary source. The notary stamp on the document belonged to a notary employed exclusively by Harold Voss's company. The county clerk who recorded it had received a pension supplement 3 times his normal entitlement 6 months after filing. That established fraud. Harlan Voss's lead attorney objected twice during this portion, both times on technical grounds, both times overruled. Then Diane said, "Your Honor, the petitioner requests permission to play an audio recording recovered from the Clearwater Lake property." The courtroom shifted. Not loudly, a general movement, a collective adjustment of attention. The judge looked at the respondent's table. "Objection." The lead attorney conferred briefly with Harlan Voss. "We object to the admissibility of a recording of unknown provenance and unverified authenticity. The recording has been authenticated by Professor Elliot Graves of the University of Montana, whose credentials and methodology are documented in Exhibit 14, Diane said. The recording device has been dated to the early 1940s by materials analysis. The voice print has been analyzed and is consistent with recordings of Thomas Aldrich's business correspondence preserved in the Ravalli County Historical Archive." Judge Hartwell looked at both tables for a moment. "I'll allow it," she said. Diane nodded to the professor, who had come from Missoula and sat in the front row of the gallery with a small portable playback device. He pressed play. Thomas Aldrich's voice filled the courtroom. Marcus had heard it twice now. He had thought that familiarity would make it easier. It did not. There was something about hearing it in this room, the wooden benches, the pale stone walls, the people who had driven from Millbrook and Hamilton and places further out to sit and listen, that made it land differently, more completely, as if the courtroom were the room this recording had always been meant to reach and had simply been waiting to find. The gallery was absolutely silent. He told me the children would be the first to go. Marcus looked at the table in front of him. He pressed his boot slightly against Scout's shoulder. The dog pressed back. "My wife's name is Margaret. My children are named James, Helen, and Clara." In his peripheral vision, he saw a woman in the back row of the gallery put her hand over her mouth. He did not look directly at her. He did not know who she was yet. They're at the door. The silence after the recording ended was the particular silence of a room full of people who are not ready for sound yet. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds. It felt much longer. Harlan Voss was looking at the table in front of him. His hands, which had been loosely clasped throughout the proceedings, were now pressed flat against the wood finger spread. It was the first involuntary thing Marcus had seen him do. Judge Hartwell cleared her throat. What happened next was not a trial, it was a hearing, and hearings have a different rhythm, more procedural, less dramatic. But the rhythm accelerated. Harlan's legal team attempted 4 separate arguments: that the recording was inadmissible, that the property chain of title had been legally established through decades of unchallenged use, that the forged signature allegation was speculative, that the connection between Harold Voss and the Aldrich disappearance was circumstantial. Diane dismantled each of them with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had spent 18 years preparing for a version of this moment. The 4th argument, the circumstantial nature of the connection between Harold Voss and the disappearance, was the one that brought Marcus to his feet. He had not planned to speak. There was no point in the proceedings where it was his turn to speak. He simply stood up, and Diane looked at him with an expression of professional alarm, and he said, "Your Honor." The judge looked at him over her glasses. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know this isn't the time, but I need to say something." A long pause. Then briefly, "Mr. Cole." He stood at the petitioner's table and did not look at Harlan Voss and did not look at the gallery. He looked at the judge. "I served in the United States military for 15 years, he said. "I've been in situations where the facts were clear and the outcome wasn't, and where powerful people use that gap to avoid accountability. Thomas Aldrich was not a soldier. He was a man with a wife and 3 children and a piece of land he owned legitimately, and he sat alone in a room 80 years ago and recorded his own fear because he knew no one with power was going to help him." He paused. "His family disappeared. 3 children. The oldest was 12. No one was ever held accountable. The man who took his land filed a forged document 9 years later and built a company on it and passed that company to his grandson, who was sitting in this room today. He stopped. I'm not asking for anything beyond what the law provides. I just want it on record that I know what this is. And I think everyone in this room knows what it is. He sat down. The courtroom was quiet. Scout put his chin on Marcus's knee under the table. Judge Hartwell delivered her ruling 40 minutes later, after a recess in which Marcus sat outside on the courthouse steps in the November cold and drank bad coffee from a vending machine and watched Scout pace the small strip of dead grass at the base of the steps. The ruling was not complicated because the evidence had not been complicated. She dismissed all claims by Voss Mineral Group to the Clearwater Lake property with prejudice. She confirmed Marcus Cole as the sole legal owner of the 412 acres, including mineral rights. She referred the matter of the forged 1952 document to the Ravalli County Prosecutor's Office and simultaneously notified the FBI field office in Helena of the potential federal dimensions of the case. She did not make findings about the Aldrich disappearance that was beyond the scope of the hearing, but she placed the wire recording and all related documents into the official court record where they would be available to any investigative authority that chose to pursue the matter. She looked at Harlan Voss's table one final time before closing. The court notes, she said, that the circumstances described in the Aldrich recording, if substantiated by further investigation, represent a matter of significant public interest that predates the current dispute by 8 decades. The court encourages relevant authorities to treat it accordingly. She closed the folder. The gavel came down. Harlan Voss passed Marcus in the corridor outside the courtroom. He stopped. His lawyers kept walking, giving him a moment or perhaps simply not wanting to be present for it. Up close, without the distance of the hearing room between them, he looked different than he had at the cabin. Smaller was the wrong word. He was still a solidly built man with good posture and expensive clothes. But something had gone out of him, or perhaps something had come off him the way a coat comes off and reveals the person underneath is less substantial than the coat suggested. He looked at Marcus for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "My grandfather told me the land was purchased honestly, that the Aldriches had sold and moved away." A pause. "He told me that my entire life." Marcus looked back at him and said nothing. "I don't know," Harlan Voss said, "if that changes anything." "No," Marcus said, "it doesn't change what happened to them, but it changes what you do next." He held the man's gaze. "Your grandfather made a choice. You've been making choices based on a story he told you. Now you know the story was wrong. That's the choice you're at now." Harlan Voss looked at him for another moment. Then he walked away down the corridor, and Marcus watched him go and felt nothing he could easily name. Scout pressed against his leg. Marcus looked down at him. The scar on his flank was barely visible under the new fur growth. "Come on," he said. "There's one more thing." The woman from the back row of the gallery was waiting outside on the courthouse steps. She was 78 years old, and she had the particular quality of old women who have been carrying a weight so long that it has become part of their posture, not bent by it exactly, but shaped by it the way a tree is shaped by prevailing wind. Her name was Ruth Aldrich Pierce, and she had driven from a care facility in Billings because Diane had found her 3 days earlier and told her what was in the wire recorder, and Ruth had sat quietly for a very long time and then said she would be there. Her mother had been Margaret Aldrich's younger sister. Margaret had married Thomas and moved to Montana. Margaret's sister had married and moved to Oregon and had a daughter named Ruth, born in 1947, 4 years after the family at Clearwater Lake disappeared. Ruth had grown up knowing almost nothing about her Montana relatives, except that her mother cried sometimes when the subject arose and would not explain why. She had spent 40 years trying to understand what her mother had not been able to tell her. She stood at the base of the courthouse steps and looked at Marcus and then looked at Scout. Marcus came down the steps and stood in front of her. He held out the velvet bags from the first box, the gold coins, the silver, the jewelry, the locket on its chain, the woman's brooch, the two plain rings. These belonged to your family, he said. They should go back to you. Ruth Aldrich Pierce looked at the bags in his outstretched hands. Her face moved through several things that Marcus recognized. Grief and something past grief, something that had been waiting longer than grief usually waits. She took the bags, she held them against her chest. Then she looked at Scout. My mother used to say, she said, and her voice was steady in the way that very old women's voices can be steady when they have had long enough to prepare for something, that the Aldriches always kept good dogs, that it was a kind of inheritance, knowing which dogs to trust. Scout stepped forward without being told. He walked to Ruth Aldrich Pierce and sat down in front of her very close and looked up at her face. She put one hand on top of his head. They stood there for a moment, the old woman and the palm and the November light coming cold and clear across the courthouse lawn. Marcus watched them and did not say anything. Some moments are not improved by words. 8 months later, in the long gold light of a Montana summer, the property at Clearwater Lake looked like a different world. It was not unrecognizable. The cave was still there. The lake was still there. The mountains were still there. The peace. But the collapsed woodshed had become a workshop. The cracked windows had been replaced. 3 new structures stood on the south side of the property, built in the same rough timber style as the original cabin sleeping cabins, warm and solid each, with a wood stove and a covered porch facing the lake. A training field had been cleared in the meadow east of the tree line. The sign at the road said Cole Aldrich Veterans Retreat. The name had been Marcus's idea, and Ruth had accepted it with a phone call, in which she said nothing for a long moment and then said yes in a voice that required no elaboration. The mineral rights had been leased to a small Montana company with a documented record of responsible extraction practices. The income was not large by Voss Mineral Group standards, but it was steady, and it was clean, and it funded the retreat's operating costs with enough left over to keep the sliding scale fees accessible to veterans who had come back from the same kinds of places Marcus had come back from and found the same doors closed. The FBI investigation into the Aldrich disappearance was ongoing. Harlan Voss had been charged with federal fraud related to the 1952 document and was cooperating with investigators in exchange for considerations his lawyers had negotiated. Whether the investigation would ever fully resolve what had happened to Thomas Aldrich and his wife and 3 children in the autumn of 1943 was not certain. Marcus had been told by the agent leading the case that certain things become very difficult to prove across 80 years of elapsed time. But Thomas Aldrich's voice was in the court record. His children's names were in the court record. The recording had been covered by a reporter from the Missoula paper whose story had been picked up by the wire services, and for 2 weeks in November, it had been read by people in places Thomas Aldrich had never been and would never know about. His family had not been forgotten. That was the thing Marcus kept returning to. Whatever else happened or did not happen, they had not been forgotten. It was Scout who led him to the last thing. It was a Tuesday morning in late June, early light, the lake flat as glass and the mountains still holding a thin stripe of last winter's snow at their highest points. Marcus was doing what he did most mornings now, walking the perimeter of the property, checking fences, noting what needed attention, the small repetitive maintenance of a place that had become, without him, entirely deciding it a home. Scout ranged ahead of him, working the ground in the easy, undirected way he moved when he was not on task but still reading everything. They reached the back of the original cave, the far interior, the section behind where the first box had been found, a part of the cave Marcus had not dug or disturbed because there had been no reason to. Scout stopped. He turned and looked at Marcus. Then he looked at the ground. Then he looked at Marcus again. Not the alert posture of a detection dog on task, something softer than that, something that reminded Marcus of the way Scout had looked at him in the early days in the truck, in the rest stops, in the campgrounds, the look that was simply, I am here, and there is something here, and I think you should know about it. All right, Marcus said. He did not have a shovel. He used his hands. The soil in this corner was shallow over a stone shelf, and it took only a few minutes to find what was there. A wooden box small the size that might hold a single deck of cards with room to spare, sealed with a strip of electrical tape that was relatively recent. Not Thomas Aldrich's time, more recent than that. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. The lid came off easily. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth that he recognized after a moment as a scrap cut from an old flannel shirt, the blue-gray, kind worn soft, was a ring. A woman's ring. Gold band, simple, with a small setting holding a modest stone. Not expensive. Chosen by someone who knew the person receiving it well enough to know she would not want expensive. He knew this ring. He had put it on Claire's finger on a September afternoon 11 years ago in a small courthouse in Denver with two witnesses they had borrowed from the clerk's office because they had wanted to do it quietly, just the two of them, without fuss. He had lost it in the months after she died. He had looked for it and not found it, and eventually concluded it was gone with everything else that had been lost in those months, and he had stopped looking. He sat on the cave floor with the ring in his palm and tried to understand how it had come to be here in this cave in Montana in a box he had not put there. He could not understand it. There was no rational path from his apartment in Denver to this cave floor. He traced every possibility and none of them held. Under the ring, folded small, was a piece of paper. The handwriting was Claire's. He would have known it anywhere, the particular slant and spacing of it, the way she crossed her T's with a slight curve. Wherever you end up, this is where I'll find you. He sat in the cave for a long time. Outside, the lake was still and the light was moving across the mountains, the way summer light moves in Montana, slowly, thoroughly, as if it has nowhere else to be. He did not try to explain it. He had explained enough things. He had spent the last year explaining documents and recordings and land surveys and forged signatures in the mechanisms by which one man's cruelty had been preserved in the earth until another man's dog refused to leave a particular corner of a cave. Some things did not need explaining. Some things needed holding. He put the ring on the chain with his dog tags, Claire's ring beside the tags, resting against his chest, where the weight of it was exactly right. He walked out of the cave into the morning. Scout was waiting for him on the porch step in the same sun, in the same light, with the same unhurried patience he had brought to every morning of their years together. Marcus sat down beside him. The lake was in front of them, and the mountains were beyond the lake, and the summer was long, and the retreat behind them was beginning to stir with the sounds of the morning, a door, a voice, the smell of coffee from the main cabin kitchen. He put his hand on Scout's back. The dog leaned into it once briefly, and then straightened, comfortable, present, watching the lake with his ears in their natural half-forward position, reading the air the way he always read the air. Good dog, Marcus said. It was not adequate. It was never going to be adequate. But Scout's tail moved once against the porch boards, a single quiet thump, which Marcus had long ago learned to understand as I know. I know. We're all right. The morning moved over the lake. The mountains held their light. Somewhere in the pines behind the retreat, a bird was saying the same thing over and over, and the lake was saying nothing at all. And Marcus Cole sat on the step he had built with his own hands and let the day begin. He had come to Clearwater looking for a place to disappear. What he found instead was that some things buried deep enough, truth, grief, love, do not rot. They crystallize. They wait in the dark with the patience of stone and wire recorders and velvet bags and small wooden boxes waiting for the particular combination of a good man and a good dog who will not stop until they have been found. Scout barked once. Sharp, certain, final. The sound crossed the lake and touched the mountains and came back.